Well, it's 9:01. Folks will join when they can. Why don't we go ahead and get started? I will call this ARPA Committee meeting to order for February 8th, 2022. Thanks everybody for joining. So what I'd like to do today, of course, we can add to the agenda as needed, is to review where we are on the ideas that we've come up for spending the ARPA funds. And so what I sent around prior to the meeting a few hours ago was a compilation that I'd gotten and pulled together that includes ideas from the Dan and the infrastructure team, but also Kevin and the sort of health ideas team, as well as for Kate, Jen, and myself on the kind of everything else category. What I attempted to do was to pull all that into a single spreadsheet and PDF that has both descriptions of those projects as well as kind of cost estimates based on the information that we have to date, recognizing that a lot of that's going to be preliminary. I also tried to put down other ideas that we really haven't adopted or thought too much about, but that have been talked about at one point or another. That's at the end of the spreadsheet that includes supporting town businesses that have lost revenue, which we talked a little bit about, and then donating some ARPA funds perhaps to other towns, which I know as Stevenson had mentioned last fall as a potential expenditure. So what we have is we have two ideas from the health team. POD in a box. That's to have a ready supply of COVID-related materials to support us should there ever be an upturn in the pandemic at 150,000. And we've got health staff remuneration, which would be essentially additional compensation for frontline workers during the period of time that we were at our worst for the pandemic. And one of the things that I threw in there in that group that we kind of talked about briefly, but wasn't on that list, and maybe we can think about how to quantify that and how you'd spend the money, but some notion of mental health grants to nonprofits. So those were the three ideas under the health team. Is there anybody on that team that would like to expand on what's written here? David, I don't know who else on your team that might have some additional comments.
Yes, the idea of the pod in the box isn't necessarily just for COVID. It's sort of a broad spectrum response capability that we could have if the need should arise, not just COVID.
Okay. And did you have a sense for how often that would have to be updated or refreshed to the extent that the materials that would expire and that kind of thing? How do we think about that as an ongoing expense?
Well, it does bother me, to think that, these things that we would be purchasing, a lot of them have life expectancies, and I'd hate to spend a lot of money on something that we'd ultimately have to throw out because they expire. And I don't know why they would expire, but sometimes the plastic deteriorates, like for the face masks and whatnot. But Kevin would know a lot more about the actual life expectancy for these things than I. But I do know that we received some PPE last year, and supposedly it's going to be expiring in the spring. And so we're trying to find places to donate it to now. Okay.
And then what's the basis for the health staff remuneration? How would that be? How did you calculate that? Is it identified individuals and pay them a one-time bonus, or how did you think about that number?
Yeah, well, Kevin and I had spoken about it, and that was a figure that he came up with independently. He didn't discuss it with anyone.
Okay.
And I think he just kind of said that it was just a ballpark figure because of the extra time and effort that staff put in running clinics after hours and being responsive 7 days, basically 7 days a week for the past 2 years.
Got it. Okay. And had you guys given any thought to this topic of mental health grants? I think we touched on it briefly in one of our prior calls, but we haven't put any meat on those bones yet. Have you guys talked about that, or do you have any initial thoughts?
Allie, I think that Allie and Kevin might have had some
preliminary
discussion.
Sorry, Allie. That's right, Allie. You thought about that. What do you think?
Yeah, and I think we added that now to the everything else group.
Okay,
And Kate and I had spoken about it, about possibly, well, I guess we'll wait till we get to that, but how
Okay.
to decide which nonprofits, they'll have to apply, basically. Right.
okay, great. Sorry, I should have put that down there. That's great. Okay.
Well,
Right.
it's not only the nonprofits that can benefit, but the seniors also. I know there's a couple of consultants, I suppose, in town that have worked with the seniors at the town hall and with seniors at the Atrium Maple and the other one, where they're also struggling with mental health issues. A lot of it, just like little kids, that they can't or have not had the socialization that they're used to. So that part of it falls into this category of can the nonprofits help, or do we go independent? There's a lady in town, Maggie Gurney. She's been working on mental health with the seniors for a long time now. I met her a couple of times, talked to her, and maybe we can invite her to give her 5 minutes of her time and talk to us, whatever the group decides.
Ally, are you tuned in all that? Any
I
reaction?
am, I'm not familiar with her. I'm not quite sure what agency is she with. Do you know what agency she's with, Bill? Or she?
Yeah, she told me. I'm not sure I wrote it down. I think she's been pretty much with the seniors and independent. We were talking a little bit about mental health and the lack of socialization with kids, because I know it happens with the younger ones. And she brought up the seniors as we sometimes forget about them. So I can let me see if I have her. I'm pretty sure I have her phone number and contact. I can ask her for information, then email it to the group.
Okay.
John, do you want comments from people as we go along, or wait till the end?
It's a good point. Maybe I'll just flip through these ideas and then we'll kind of backtrack with comments. I want to make sure we get your input on the everything else ideas before we go. So just briefly on infrastructure, we've got 7 items here that team has come up, and I see Dan's on the phone now, so we'll get his input. I won't go through the descriptions. You can kind of see what we have here, from drainage upgrades, sanitary sewer, some bridge repairs, as well as other drainage there down along that point, but about 3.8 million in funds. My question on that, though, and maybe Kate, you know, is what's the status of those capital projects with regard to what's in the budget this year, and where do those stand on your priority list? Maybe we don't have to go through that now, but I'd be interested in where those are on the town list of projects.
Well, none of these are in the budget.
Okay.
And I think priority wise, the Old Kings Highway, I actually think Ed has them listed probably in priority order. I know the Old Kings Highway South is a very big priority.
Okay. So we'll come back to infrastructure, and then finally there are a number of smaller suggestions for town projects that have already been teed up, and by that I mean there's been some planning and thinking and prioritization, as well as initial cost estimates for all these items, and you can see that on the wish list there. In addition, Pam sent over some Parks and Rec suggestions where she had a list of things that I believe are shown in priority order in terms of what she suggested, and their total costs of about $1 million. So all in all, we have ideas that roughly total about 7.2 million, which would more than cover the 6.4 that we have in ARPA grants. Let me just stop there and see if anybody has any reactions or questions, initial thoughts on these ideas as I've laid them out.
2 thoughts on the health list. First, we had paid nurses for the second round of clinics where we hadn't paid them the original round, and our assumption when agreeing to pay them in that second round was that it would be reimbursed through the ARPA grant. So that doesn't appear to be the number that's listed there for health staff remuneration. There are limits in the grant for what we can pay employees. So I'm not sure that that was the grant restrictions were considered in putting that number together. But I would
So
have,
sorry, so to make sure I understand, there was a stipulation that monies paid to the nurses in kind of a second round of compensation that the town would be reimbursed for those expenses from the ARPA grant?
our thought with reimbursing, with paying them to begin with, because we couldn't get them otherwise, was that those payments would be eligible for reimbursement under this grant.
Got
So
it.
I think that that should be reflected in this. I don't have the number. We'll have to get that number for you.
Okay.
But the concept of paying staff additional funds out of this, out of the ARPA grants, I have a problem with singling out one group.
I hear you, but
There's,
you'd be
there's a
able,
lot of people who went way above their normal work hours, their normal work, parameters during
but
the past 2 years.
you'd be okay using some of the ARPA money to reimburse the town for some of the compensation they had to pay out for this extra time the nurses spend.
Well, paying the nurses, period. But when it comes to the rest of the employees, I have a hard time singling out one group because there were so many people who did
Okay.
so much. And then there are other people who maybe they think they did and they didn't, but to single certain people out and we don't have any objective measures to say employee Joe deserves this and employee Bob doesn't.
Got it. Okay.
And so you will create a nightmare for me if we don't pay everybody something. And I don't think we should pay everybody something.
Could you, would there be union issues in terms of?
And there would be union issues. Yeah, and there would be just, how do you objectively determine the effort? And satisfy every employee that, yes, what we did was fair.
Yeah, my general view is that we should probably avoid doing this. I agree it creates a lot of problems and it feels a lot better to have investment type expenditures as opposed to something like this. So, okay, well, you've got
John?
the microphone. Go ahead.
John, Dan here. It appears this list that a number of items under Parks and Rec grants are also listed above under everything else. The Cherry Lawn Playground, the McGuan Playground, the Woodland Parking.
Yeah.
So those are identical amounts. So it looks like they're
Okay.
redundant. So it looks like maybe the total is less than the 7.
Okay, I appreciate that. This was done rushed and I
Yep,
thought actually Pam sent an email to all of us and I thought all of that was incremental to what Kate and Jen had proposed, but I will clean that up on this list. That's great. Thank you.
Yep, thank you.
Okay. Kate, since you're talking, do you want to talk, you or Jen want to talk a little bit about some of the everything else ideas, how you thought about that and any further commentary on what you've got here?
Well, what I started by talking to Jen and kind of making sure we were on the same page, and we looked at things that would give budgetary relief in the current fiscal year. We looked for things that would be one-time expenditures. Don't believe that this money should be used for ongoing expenditures. We looked at outer years to see things that people had proposed in their capital, 6-year capital plan that could perhaps be moved up into the current year with the nearer term with the funding being available. So where you see like FY24 or BOS approved, that indicates that BOS approved are things that the Board of Selectmen has put forward in the current budget. The other ones are like FY24, that's when Parks and Rec had proposed that the Cherry Lawn Playground be funded. Things that say NA are things that we didn't have, were not in the budget. Some of them were swags. feeling that we needed to provide some mental health support, and just trying to give a number to that. With
Okay,
the,
so the mental health grants, kind of we were talking about earlier, that the straw man proposal is the 250,000 here.
yes,
Or you got it. Okay.
yeah, and that's just a number I came up with. But knowing that one of our larger providers has long wait lists for being able to service families, and thinking that we could provide some great support to them to get the families the mental health support that they need, at least for the next year or so. The Park and Rec grants, just to let you know what I had done, I asked Pam to put together a list, saying, we wanted some of this money to be visible, the use of the money to be visible to the public, that they could look out and see, oh, ARPA did that. So I said, if we gave you 250, if we gave you 500, if we gave you $1 million, how would you use it and touch all the parks?
Yep.
So that's why there is some crossover. She was saying, okay, this would be her priority. If we only gave them 250, this is what they would do first.
Yeah, I'm sorry about the duplication. I didn't go back and look and see that it wasn't fully incremental. Okay. Given last night's discussion with the Board of Finance and F&B and their concerns over some of the budgets, what was the total in non-bonded capital for the town in the budget? Do you recall that?
3.4 million.
Okay, and then it's 6 million if you add in the fire trucks, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so the 3.2 million, in your judgment, would not sort of meet our bonding criteria, is that right?
Well, many of them are small things, like, you can see some of these here, like $35,000 for the police department switches, or $25,000 for the drone. These are not the kind of things you bond.
Yeah, so one suggestion would be, is kind of given budgetary pressure, wouldn't one idea be to fund those sort of P&L capital items, the ones that you would not bond out of this coming fiscal year out of ARPA, and then take the balance and apply it to all these other projects?
Yeah, that's one way of doing it. I wouldn't like take all of our capital, because some of what's in capital things like reval, or some of the things that we buy on a regular basis for the fire departments, like the SCBA, the radios. Those are not, I look at them as more ongoing things. So if we pay for those out of ARPA money this year, we're going to have a hole to fill next year.
Okay, because one thing you could do is take the ones that meet the kind of visible use of money criteria, right?
Yep.
Take those on that list.
Yep.
Pull that out, pop that on this list, and take that out of the proposed budget. Or get
Yeah, and I was looking for the one and done kind of things.
Yeah, right. That better said. So maybe one thing you could do is that for this everything else list, one is we'll clean up the redundancies that I put in there, but two, maybe add to the list those specific items that are in the proposed budget this year that meet the one and done criteria, and just have that as a subtotal to say, if we send that to the Board of Finance, we could recommend that they cut those items and that we fund those with ARPA money.
Okay, I'll go through and make sure we've got all the one and dones.
Okay.
And I just, one other thing I want to point out, you see joint and mortar repair for NHFD twice. That is not a duplication. They'd asked for, in the current year budget, $13,000 to do one side of the building, and the total project would be $52,000. So, so I put it in two places.
Okay, and I kind of jumbled the order a bit by just prioritizing by dollar amount, so we can probably clean that up too. Okay. Any reactions to the everything else list? What do you guys think of just the discussion we've had just now? Martha?
Well, I understand, the loss of revenue and how you can fund all these things, but trying to adhere more to the ARPA, drainage and water, and let's face it, during the pandemic, parks and recreation facilities experienced, a great deal of use. I don't know, I probably have more of a bias towards not doing something like, mortar and whatnot. To me, that just, we can use it under loss of revenue, but I would like to look to funding more in the recreation area, but that's just my opinion.
What's interesting, it's an interesting point. I think the optics of ARPA grants are exactly as you described. We kind of want to spend it on in areas that you've mentioned. If I think about this just in a strict budgetary standpoint and take away all the optics, it seems like an efficient way to do this is to try and use these funds to relieve budget pressure this year. And so if you come in and you pay for a lot of this just out of the ARPA money because it's there, that doesn't actually mean that we can't do exactly what you're talking about, right? And in a sense, a lot of those projects, particularly if they're bigger ones, are ones that we would bond anyway. And so what you could do is say, tell you what, we're going to reserve a certain amount of this money to cover things that don't feel ARPA-like in terms of their purpose, but allow us to reduce budget pressure, while at the same time saying there's some of these other things that we want to do or add that simply can be bonded. In other words, we don't have to pay for them out of ARPA money. It's more efficient to bond those anyway, and we just spread the cost over time. But ARPA helps us reduce the current budget at a time when we need to. So you still get bang for your buck. It's just sort of an accounting issue as to how the funds are deployed and set up and used.
And incidentally, I didn't mean to exclude, I mean, to me, mental health support, if that's a need, to me, that, directly ties to the pandemic.
Yeah, but members of the Board of Selectmen are in particular need of those funds. So I'm kidding. Okay. All right.
The one thing,
Something
John,
else.
I would, Dan again, on mental health, what I would want to make sure we don't do is make a one-time grant, and then have those funds exhausted, and then we've kind of set up an agency to fail by, with a big infusion up front, and then so I think if I'm totally in support of a large grant for mental health, but I think we should do it in a way that makes sure that the agency receiving the funding is set up to succeed. And I don't know exactly how that mechanic would work. Ally probably would, but that's my only concern with respect to a big check being written. I just want to make sure that it's done in a way that enhances the odds of success for the agency. Otherwise, I like the way this conversation has gone. I think we're kind of plowing down the right course with respect to these projects.
I think that's a great point. Kate brought up earlier this notion of one and done. I think that should apply properly across all the funding that we're thinking about deploying to try to make it one and done. And by that, you mean we don't set up something that requires substantial future expenditure to maintain. So that's why sort of fixing a capital project or alleviating one particular problem feels better than saying, oh, here's seed money for now some expensive thing that you have to maintain going forward. I think you're exactly right. Other comments or questions? Bill?
I guess under everything else, John, I had shared a copy of an email I sent to the chamber. The chamber tomorrow is going to ask a basic or preliminary survey of its members. Were they affected by COVID in 2021? Did their business temporarily close or close a location? Some of them have 2 or 3 locations. And did they increase or decrease or number of employees? And it's a little bit taken from that, was it January 4th, where the East Windsor plan was shared with us, John?
Yeah.
And they have some of those grants. They weren't big for some of the businesses. I cannot claim any of this because I didn't do poorly during COVID either year. And a lot of retail stores didn't, but I know that a lot of restaurants and services were suffering. So under everything else, do we open that category for $5,000, $10,000 per service that needed it and can prove that they were adversely affected? Big question. The East Windsor plan, I think, gave out 100,000. I did not read anything in the Fairfield plan.
This is one of those ones that feels a little bit like incremental staff remuneration. Kind of hard to make the decision as to which businesses merit that. And if you say, well, I'm going to cast a wide net and have all businesses qualify, then the amount of money that, given the amount of money that's available for us to spend it's going to feel small in the scheme of things. You know, if a restaurant gets like 1020, gets $10,000, I'm not sure that really moves the
Yeah.
needle for them. You know, toy box, $1 million, that might move the needle, but but it just feels a little clunky to try and go in and adjudicate that. I love these kind of one and done permanent investments that have got optics associated with them. Feels really good and like a good deployment of those funds. So we'll think about it. But my general reaction is like incremental remuneration, too hard to do fairly and in a way that's going to be impactful. Other reactions, any thoughts? Okay, let's start. So what we're going to do is I'll work with Kate and Jen. We'll sharpen up this list a little bit, get some redundancies cleaned up, and give some further thought to the allocation of the funds from a budgeting standpoint, while at the same time trying to make sure some of these other projects get done. One thing we could do, by the way, is to say out of the ARPA money, this amount of money is going to relieve current year or next fiscal year capital expenditures, and we'd use a certain amount of money for that. Then we'd use the balance for this. And then we'd have some other projects, to Martha's good point, that feel more ARPA-like, that wouldn't necessarily be covered by ARPA funds, but would be candidates for bonding that we could all work into that. So you've got kind of something that's bigger than the ARPA pool of money, but covers all these bases that we've talked about. So, okay, so we'll come back and send around by email a suggestion as to what that is, and then maybe prioritize some of these. Second question I had is, if we're ready to move to the prioritization phase, I just wanted to ask, does anybody feel like we need to do any more idea generation? And by that, I mean, engage other constituencies. Do you feel like we should have a public hearing or a meeting to maybe go through a prioritized list? In other words, we maybe have one more meeting, go through our prioritized recommendations, and then have a hearing to get kind of public reaction to that? Or should we kind of say that's probably enough, and what we should do is present that to the Board of Selectmen?
Well, I hope, John, you have the HSBC thing on your schedule for March 2nd.
Yes, okay, I do actually.
Something may or something may not come out of that.
Okay,
Ally will have a pretty good idea.
I would be in favor of a public hearing, but I also am cognizant that the budget clock is running. So if the Board of Finance is going to count on ARPA funding for some capital projects, that has to be a decision made prior to the first week of April, and hopefully well inside that.
yeah,
So
I don't, great point. I don't think we're having any trouble meeting that deadline.
Yeah, well, my only concern is if we're going to do a public hearing, we have to, provide enough notice, but we are in early February, so I think the timetable works.
Yeah, what I propose for a public hearing is that we simply do a Zoom meeting. I wouldn't do anything kind of in person. And we just set it up and see who signs up. And if we don't get much input or a sign up, that'll just be a short meeting. But to your point, we should publicize it. And if citizens or others have ideas to offer, I'd like to hear them. One thing I want to do, though, is have one more meeting of this group where we have a prioritized list and say, absent public input, this is what we would do. We'll try to publicize that, I don't know, newspaper or some outreach, and then announce this public meeting and invite input. And then once that's done, then we'd have a finalist to present to the Board of Selectmen. And again, that should be well in advance of the Board of Finance's deadline.
Has there been any outreach to the Board of Ed in terms of how they're going to spend their money? Any coordination there?
I have not heard that. Kate or Jen, do you guys have any sense of that? And they got what, 900,000?
No, they've got their own money, so we haven't, I don't think it's up to us to influence them, and they have not reached out to us asking for any of our money.
Oh, but we don't have a sense, but it was about 900,000 they got, is that right?
I don't know that.
Okay. All right, good question. Maybe I'll pop a note over to Duke and see what they say. Martha.
Just one question, just for my own edification. What do we estimate our loss of revenue to be anyway? I can't remember. Do you know, Jen?
formula, we experienced loss of revenue, but in reality, we really didn't.
We're having trouble hearing you, Jen. Can you?
Is this any better?
Yeah, it's better.
So we didn't, in actuality, we didn't really experience any loss of revenue, but under their formula, we did. And now the formula is actually not even required because it's a $10 million
Right.
base number.
Okay.
But the formula assumed we would have had naturally 4% revenue growth, which we don't have.
Okay.
And I mean, the reality is we collect most of our money from property taxes, which we'll either collect or we'll eventually collect. And then the rest of it in terms of revenues are things like building permits. And even if those were delayed, we're eventually going to collect those too. So I'm a little less worried about the loss of revenues as an issue to the town. Other comments? Okay, all right. Well then, terrific. I appreciate everybody joining the meeting today. Why don't we go ahead and we'll wrap this up. Let me propose that we get together maybe a little sooner. It won't take long for us to finalize this list. And if everybody's available, what we could potentially do is say a week from today, so the 15th, and what we'll do is send around a spreadsheet in advance that's got a kind of final proposed straw man proposed list that's prioritized with cost estimates as best we have them. We'll build in some contingencies. We don't spend all the money, but try to come up with something that's reasonable. And then we'll make a final decision about having a public hearing, which we'll try to get organized as soon as possible after we finalize this list so that it can be published in advance of the hearing. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. I'll work with Kate and Jen to sharpen up the spreadsheet, come up with a prioritized list, get the meeting for next Tuesday on the calendar, 9 o'clock, same time, and we will go from there. Anything else for the good of the order? Okay, Frank. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Frank, go ahead.
Do we need to approve the minutes?
Okay, good point. They look fine to me. Does anybody have any edits to that? Okay, motion to approve the minutes. Francis, second. Martha, all in favor?
Aye.
The ayes have it. Okay. Kate or Jen, anything else we need to cover? Okay, we're good. Thanks everybody for participating. Motion to adjourn. Okay, Bill, second, Frank. All right, we stand adjourned. Thanks and have a great day. We'll see you next Tuesday. Thank you, Kate. See you later.